Hi, fifth graders. Mrs. McMahon here. I'm going to be reading a book called Can We Save the Tiger? Identifying the point and the reasons. And then we're going to be talking about what evidence is to support those points. So, can we save the tiger? The world's quite a big place, but it's not that big when you consider how much there is to squeeze into it. After all, it's home not just to billions of people, but the most amazing number of other kinds of living things too. And we're all jostling for space. We humans have changed the world a lot over the years to make room for ourselves and to produce the things we need. We've turned forests into farmland, dammed rivers, and built towns and cities to live in. Some of the other animals and plants that we share the earth with have coped with the changes very well, but some haven't. In fact, some have coped so badly that they're not here anymore. They're extinct. That means we'll never see a live dodo or a Steller's sea cow or a marsupial wolf or a great auk or a broad-faced patoro. I I could go on and on. And then there are all those other species that are still around, but only barely. They're in danger of becoming extinct, just like the dodo and Steller's sea cow. There are so many endangered species all over the world that it's hard to pick out some special ones. Still, I'm sure you'll all agree that tigers are pretty special. Tigers are big and they're beautiful and they're fierce, and all this makes life difficult for them these days. Because they're big, they need a lot of space, but the countries where they live, like India and Indonesia, have huge numbers of people in them too, all trying to make a living and all needing to be fed. And because they're beautiful, people have always hunted them for their skins. They also kill them for their bones and meat to use as medicines. And because tigers are fierce, they don't mix very well with humans. They usually eat deer and antelope and other wild animals, but when there are people nearby, they may end up eating farm animals like cows, sheep, and goats instead. Sometimes, though hardly ever, some tigers, usually old or sick ones, end up eating people too. So if you were a poor farmer trying to make a living with a couple of cows and a few goats, you might not be too happy if you found there was a hungry tiger living nearby. And if you knew that someone might pay you more for a tiger skin and some bones than you could earn in 3 whole months working in the fields, then you might find it very tempting to set a trap or two, even if you knew it was against the law. Perhaps it's not too surprising that there aren't that many tigers left. Many other animals are also running out of room, including these ones. But not all endangered species need lots of space. Take Partula snails. They're tiny, so small that one of them could happily spend its whole life in a medium sized bush. And they're not at all scary, but like tigers, they're in big trouble, although nobody really meant to give them a hard time. Partula snails live on islands in the Pacific Ocean, miles from anywhere. There are lots of different kinds, and they've been here for millions of years. When the first people arrived on the islands hundreds of years ago, the Partula snails didn't seem to mind too much and just got on with their lives, feeding on leaves in the forests. Then, about 100 years ago, people brought a different kind of snail to the islands. This was the giant African land snail. They brought it because it's good to eat. It makes especially delicious snail soup and it is very easy to look after. The giant African land snails took well to the islands, and soon there were tons of them, many more than anyone wanted to eat. And it turned out that they had pretty healthy appetites themselves. Soon they were chomping their way through people's crops as if there was no tomorrow. Something had to be done. Unfortunately, what people decided to do was to introduce a third kind of snail. This one was called the rosy euglandina, and its favorite food was other snails. The idea was that the rosy euglandina would feed on the giant African land snails and stop them from eating everyone's crops. This worked a bit, but not that well. There are still plenty of the giant snails on the islands. The problem was that the rosy thought that the Partula snails, which weren't doing anyone any harm, were the most delicious snack and quickly started eating them all up instead. Now there are hardly any Partula snails at all. Some kinds have become extinct. Some now live only in zoos, and a few still hang on in places that the Rosa euglandina hasn't managed to reach yet. Other animals, including these ones, are also affected by predators that have been introduced by people. Ugly things can be endangered too. Perhaps I'm being unfair, but I don't think many people would call vultures exactly beautiful. But they are definitely very useful animals. They eat carrion, the bodies of animals that have already died, which means they do a very good job of keeping places clean. In India, until recently, there were millions of vultures, and they mostly fed on the bodies of cows that had died in the countryside. A while ago, people began to notice that there were a lot fewer vultures around than they remembered, but they weren't being hunted, and there were still places for them to nest and plenty of dead cows for them to eat. People also noticed that the vultures they did see, perched on trees or buildings, often looked all droopy and miserable as if they were sick. Was there some disease, like vulture measles or flu, spreading across India? It wasn't that. But it took some detective work to find out what the problem was. Farmers were giving their cows a kind of medicine that was very poisonous to vultures. When the vultures fed on the body of a cow that had been given the medicine, they got sick and died. Now that everyone knows what the problem is, maybe something can be done about it. People can try to persuade the government to stop the particular medicine from being sold and can try to explain to farmers why it shouldn't be used. But it's never as simple as that. The companies that make the medicine will lose out on the money they get from selling it and may try to persuade the government not to do anything. Who cares about a few ugly vultures anyway? And even if it's not being made anymore, there will still be lots of it around in stores all over the country and in farmers' cupboards. Getting everyone everywhere to stop using it is really difficult. And by the time that's happened, it may be too late for the wild vultures. These animals have also become accidentally endangered by human actions or disease. Sometimes, though, we have managed to do the right thing in time. There are quite a lot of species that have nearly gone extinct and that we have saved, at least for the time being. One of these is the American bison. The American bison is the biggest land animal in North America. A few hundred years ago, there were millions of them roaming the prairies and woodlands. Native people hunted them for their meat and skins, but they didn't kill too many, so there were always plenty around. Then Europeans arrived with their horses and guns, and things began to change. They killed huge numbers of bison for their skins. They plowed up parts of the prairies to plant wheat, and they turned the rest into ranches where they could graze cattle. All this left less and less room for the bison. Suddenly, there were just two small herds of wild bison left, and a few kept in pens by ranchers. The bison was in danger of becoming extinct without anyone really noticing. Luckily, people did begin to take notice, and at the last minute, they started to do things. The ranchers who kept the captive bison started breeding from them, and governments set up reserves to protect the wild herds. Bison numbers began to grow. Now there are hundreds of thousands again. Most of them are still kept by ranchers who treat them like cattle, but there are also some wild herds. There are still nowhere near as many as there once were, but there are enough for us not to have to worry about them going extinct anytime soon. These animals were all once endangered but are now doing well. Bison are actually quite easy animals to look after. As long as you don't hunt them and make sure they've got a reasonable amount of space, they pretty much take care of themselves. Not all endangered species are like that, though. Some you can't take your eye off of for a minute. The kakapo is one of these. Kakapos are amazing birds that live in New Zealand. They are huge, jumpy parrots that can't fly and come out only at night. They live as long as people do. They're fussy about what they eat, like a lot of people, and they usually only breed once every 3 or 4 years when their favorite trees produce a bumper crop of fruit and seeds. The trouble is that because cockapos can't fly, they are easy prey for animals like rats, dogs, cats, and stoats that like to eat them or their eggs. Before people arrived on New Zealand, there were none of these predators there and lots of cockapos. Then, about 1,500 years ago, people started coming, bringing these animals with them, some by accident, like rats, and some on purpose, like dogs, and later cats and stoats. The cockapos got rarer and rarer. At one point, people thought they might be extinct. Then a handful were discovered in the far south, but there were cats and stoats there too, and every year there were fewer cockapos. Conservationists decided to catch as many of the survivors as possible and put them on small islands out of reach of predators. That worked, but unfortunately, the cockapos hardly ever bred. More were dying of old age and in accidents than were hatching out. By 1995, there were just 51 alive in the world. Since then, people have redoubled their efforts to try to save the kakapo. They guard the islands to make sure no predators arrive. They've put collars with radio transmitters on the cockapos to keep track of them. They've given them extra food to try to persuade them to breed. And when they do breed, they keep an eye on the nests using remote controlled cameras. They've even put heaters over the nests to make sure the eggs or chicks don't get too cold when their mother is off feeding at night. It's all working, and very, very slowly, the number of cockapos is growing. By 2010, there were over 120 cockapos, still hardly any, but more than 51. These are some of the animals that have been brought back from the brink of extinction, but are still very rare. So you see, trying to save just one endangered species like the kakapo can be hard work, and there are thousands of them altogether. What's more, saving species is going to get more complicated. We haven't just changed the world in obvious ways, like cutting down forests and building roads. We're changing the climate too, and that affects everything everywhere. Because of climate change, places like the Arctic that haven't been affected very much by people up till now are starting to change fast. And that means that some animals that we thought were safe, like polar bears, are now in trouble. When it comes to looking after all the species that are already endangered, there's such a lot to do that sometimes it might all seem to be too much, especially when there are so many other important things to worry about. But if we stop trying, the chances are that pretty soon we'll end up with a world where there are no tigers or elephants or sawfishes or whooping cranes or albatrosses or ground iguanas. And I think that would be a shame, don't you? So when I think about what the point, right, when we identify what the point in a text is, remember the main point the author is trying to make is what that author believes or what that author wants you to believe, right? So we've got different points, but I believe the author kind of wants you, right? The author wants you to understand the importance of caring, right? Caring about, or the importance of, or understand like maybe your impact or the importance of your impact on endangered animals. So the point of this book was really to get you to care and understand kind of humans' impact, right? So when I say you, maybe not necessarily your impact, but like humans' impact on the endangered animals. And the author wants you to care about these animals, right? So that's kind of the point of the text, is to get you to both understand the impact of humans and care about these animals. And then when it comes to reasons in this text, like what is the reasons the author gives to support that, we have a couple different sections that the text was broken into. So what I noticed is that this first section here talked about how some animals, such as the tiger, right? So it gave the tiger as an example. It said some animals, such as the tiger, were endangered or extinct, right? It talks specifically about extinct animals before we get into the stale, right? So extinct animals based on human action, and then also how some animals are endangered. So when it comes to that idea of a reason, right? One reason is that humans are creating problems for animals, causing some to become extinct and others endangered. Now, before we move on, what I want to talk about is this next piece that we're identifying today. We're identifying a new vocabulary word or defining it, and that vocabulary word is evidence. So we've talked about evidence before. We use evidence or quotes, or we paraphrase parts of the text to support things that we claim. So for example, if this is the point that we claim the author is trying to get at, this is one reason. What is our evidence? What does the text specifically say to give us that information? So say, for example, here, I could find a piece of evidence, right, that the text said. So when I'm looking at this, I might go all the way back to this first page where I know it talked about the impact that humans have, right? Because that's my reason here, is that humans are creating problems for animals, causing some to become extinct and others endangered. And here specifically is where I came up with that reason. So it says right here, we humans have changed the world a lot over the years to make room for ourselves and to produce the things we need. And then down here it says, some of the other animals and plants that we share the earth with have coped with the changes, but some haven't. So when it comes to my evidence to support that reason and point, my evidence is going to be, so I'm going to start with, every time I put evidence, I start with the text says that humans have changed the world and some animals have coped while others haven't. And then I could go on even to provide a second piece of evidence specifically about the tiger. So if you remember, I talked about the tiger becoming extinct because of humans, right? So I could give another piece of evidence from the text to support that reason. And this piece of evidence would be a specific fact from the text. So remember, the reason is the general reason from this whole section, right? The point is the point the author's trying to make from the entire book. That evidence is a really into the text, right? It's a specific sentence from the text that I'm looking at to support that point and to support that reason. So when I think about a specific piece of evidence I might look at within this section of this reason, I know it specifically talks about how humans are hunting tigers for their skin, right? Humans, I'll put, for example, right? Because I'm giving an example from the text. So for example, humans hunt tigers for their skin. That was one example from the text. And that's another piece of evidence to support that reason. So here is my evidence to support my reason. So I'll highlight that for you. There's my evidence to support my reason. And then moving on, we've got two other reasons. we came across another reason, right, that we should care about our impact on the endangered animals was that we brought, right? So for example, here we brought over snails. So the section was about how we brought over snails that endangered another snail without us realizing it. And here they talked about a third reason where it talked about how we're using chemicals or medicines that impact things like the vulture without us realizing it, right? So those are two different things that humans have done to impact the endangered animals, how humans have impacted. And that relates back to my point. So another reason is humans have brought new species that kill or eat a native meaning it's from that area, it's native to that place, species, causing it to become extinct or endangered. And a last reason is that humans have used medicines and chemicals for their own good that kills native species So when it comes to these two reasons, it's going back to that idea, that vocabulary word that we're introducing today of evidence. So I need to provide a piece of evidence from the text. So I might once again say the text says, or I might say, for example. So I would say either the text says, or I would say, for example, to kind of provide that piece of evidence from the text. So the text said, humans brought a new snail that killed the native snail almost causing extinction. So that would be my piece of evidence, right? So when we think about evidence, that would be my piece of evidence to support that point. And then my piece of evidence to support this would be another piece, an example. So I could say, for example, or I could say the text said, to provide another piece of evidence to kind of support that point. So this one with the vultures, right? People used medicine. So humans used, I should put for example. For example, humans used medicine for their cows. The native vultures ate the dead cows and died from the medicine. Oh. Mrs. McMahon and her spelling today. There. Died from the medicine. So that would be my piece of evidence to support that reason. So remember, evidence is facts from the text, like what are some of the facts or details from the text that support the reasons that you found. So we find reasons in the text that are those general reasons from specific sections, right? And then we find evidence from the text to support those reasons. So the purple is what we call our evidence. So your job is going to be to continue with the your job is going to be to continue with the gum chewing article to identify some evidence to support the reasons we found yesterday.